At the age of 50, men often think back on the dreams they once had. They think and lament that the years they could have used to achieve those dreams are gone forever. This feeling that time was running out was especially strong in Hitler. In 1939, during the last few days of August, he lamented to his entourage, "I'm already 50, I can't wait any longer." Fleeting time pushed him and his empire toward that great war. In the final moments before the war broke out, Goering, however, started to have second thoughts. He said, "Now is not the time to go all out." Hitler looked at his closest deputy and said resolutely, "In my life I have always given it my all." August 25, 1939. The port of Danzig, the battleship Schleswig-Holstein. This German battleship was already old. She was built 30 years earlier and had taken part in the largest naval battle of World War I, the Battle of Jutland. That was the last hurrah for battleships and the German Navy's final breakout attempt. 2 years later, Germany was defeated. The Treaty of Versailles only allowed Germany to keep 8 battleships. The Schleswig-Holstein was one of them. Most of the warships from her era were sunk or dismantled. Only she miraculously continued to sail the Atlantic for another 20 years. This battleship had weathered many storms and witnessed the rise and fall of the German Empire. When she sailed into the port of Danzig in 1939, people welcomed her enthusiastically. This was because German officials had announced it as a friendly visit. The locals hoped the warship would bring peace and ease the growing international tensions. But the soldiers on board knew they were there for another reason. They were quietly waiting for orders from Berlin. On September 1st, Operation White officially began. The main guns of the Schleswig-Holstein, the turrets slowly turned towards the city of Danzig in the dawn's early light. The residents there were not yet awake, completely unaware of the disaster about to strike. In an instant, the Schleswig-Holstein's 4 main guns fired all at once, marking the first shots of World War II. The enormous blast shattered the peaceful dawn. This ancient warship, a relic from the First World War, with its furious roar, reminded the world once again of the horrors of war. And it wasn't just in Danzig. Along the lengthy German border, the German army launched a ferocious tide-like assault. The military reforms Hitler pushed through before the war were about to face the test of real combat. The painful experiences of World War I gave Hitler a strong aversion to trench warfare. He longed for a swift, decisive victory and was quite dismissive of his generals' conservative views. When in 1933, he saw the motorized troops directed by Guderian, he said with delight, "This is exactly what I need." He put Guderian in charge of all organization and training for the armored forces, vigorously pushing for the army's mechanization and pouring vast resources into areas that could be game changers, like tanks, paratroopers, submarines, and dive bombers. All of this ultimately evolved into a military revolution that put the German army at the forefront of the era. They, more than the armies of other nations, realized early on that future warfare would no longer be a slow, grinding battle to break out of trenches. Instead, it would be a war of movement, using tank assaults to rapidly tear through enemy lines. The wide-open plains of Western Poland became the perfect stage for the German armored divisions to show their might. Under the cover of the Air Force, German armored units concentrated on a single point with overwhelming firepower. They easily sliced through the Polish army's defensive lines, then quickly pushed deep into the rear. In Poland, before anyone could even react, huge numbers of assembly points, command posts, communication centers, and railway hubs had been completely destroyed, leaving the Polish forces on the front lines, cut off and surrounded in total chaos. The results for the German army were astonishing. In just 36 days, they had achieved victory, capturing 700,000 Polish soldiers, while only 10,000 German soldiers were killed. Unlike the Eastern Front, which was ablaze with artillery fire, the Franco-German border on the Western Front was strangely quiet. At the time, Germany had only deployed 32 divisions on the Western Front, while France had 91. If France had honored its promise and launched a full-scale attack from the west, trapping Germany in a pincer move with Poland, the outcome of World War II might have been very different. But that's just a hypothetical. Although France didn't surrender until 1940, it had already lost the war back in 1936 in the Rhineland and in 1938 in Munich. The French had already lost this war. They feared war before it broke out, and after the war started, they clung to the fantasy of winning with the fewest possible casualties. They held on to this wishful thinking that, rather than launching a reckless attack while unprepared and suffering pointless casualties, it was better to wait for the Germans to come to them. Let them bleed themselves dry against the Maginot Line. With this kind of thinking, the French went back on their promise and just stood by and watched Poland fall. France's weakness and Poland's defeat caused Hitler's popularity back in Germany to skyrocket once again. I could not find a single German who thought Germany was wrong to destroy Poland wrote the American journalist living in Berlin at the time, William Shirer. After the German victory, Hitler came to Warsaw overflowing with pride. The raw materials were plentiful in this city he had destroyed. So far, everything seemed to be going very smoothly. There was only one thing that worried him slightly, and that was Winston Churchill. This man, long regarded by the German government as the West's number one warmonger, had returned to the British cabinet. The end of the Polish campaign marked the beginning of the Polish people's suffering. The Nazis ruled the land with brutal force. For the sake of their so-called New Order, the SS launched a series of racial attacks. In the first week of the invasion, they were executing 200 people a day, but Hitler felt that pace was still too slow. He ordered that any prisoner could be shot without a trial, whether they were men, women, or children. All people of Polish descent and anyone who spoke Polish were to be killed, so said Hitler. Under the Führer's directive, the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Gestapo competed with one another to commit atrocities against the Poles, reporting the number of Poles they slaughtered to win favor. When a junior Wehrmacht officer reported to his superior that they hadn't killed a single Pole that week, his superior was completely shocked. Have all the Poles in your area been killed already? In the end, 5 million Poles died in World War II, but the Nazi rampage of slaughter had only just begun. The tragedy that unfolded on Polish soil would be repeated time and again in other countries. The next battlefield of World War II was in Northern Europe. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, sparking the Winter War. This war would have a profound impact on the later Soviet-German War. To understand this conflict, we first need to look at Finland's history. Finland was once an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Tsarist Russian Empire. After World War I and the collapse of Tsarist Russia, Finland became independent. The newly formed Soviet Union officially recognized Finland's sovereignty, but behind their backs. On the ground, they were constantly supporting the proletarian revolution inside Finland, hoping to turn Finland into a communist country as well, and then reabsorb it into their own territory. This is what sparked the Finnish Civil War in 1918. To defeat the Finnish Red Army, which was backed by the Soviets, the Finnish White Army accepted help from Germany. In the end, the White Army defeated the Red Army. From then on, Finland aligned with Germany and was hostile towards the Soviet Union. And although the two sides later signed a Soviet-Finnish non-aggression pact, the relationship between the two countries never truly relaxed. For Finland, the Soviet Union was just too close and too big of a threat. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was also worried about Finland, fearing it might provide Germany a path to attack them. In the later German-Soviet non-aggression pact, Finland became a bargaining chip. Germany tacitly allowed the Soviet Union to annex Finland in exchange for the Soviets' cooperation with Germany. Hitler initially thought the Soviet Union would win easily, because Finland was just so incredibly weak. It was a small country with a total population of only 3.7 million, smaller than the population of a single Soviet city. But the result of the Winter War ended up surprising everyone. When the war began, the Soviet Union sent in 450,000 soldiers, over 2,000 tanks, and about 1,000 aircraft. For Finland, with only 150,000 soldiers, a few dozen tanks, and just over 100 planes, it was an absolutely crushing force. Facing such a desperate situation, Finland didn't give up. On the contrary, they showed an incredible will to resist. The entire nation was united. Even many members of the Communist Party rose up to resist the Soviet invasion. The Finnish army took advantage of the complex terrain, the severe cold, and their close-knit organization to fight back fiercely. On the other side, the Soviet Red Army had just been through the Great Purge. Its command capabilities were poor, and it was seriously underprepared. They also made the mistake of being arrogant and underestimating the enemy. In the end, the Red Army suffered over 300,000 casualties, but only managed to gain a tenth of Finland's territory in return. With 70,000 casualties, the Winter War made the Soviet Union a complete laughingstock. It also led Germany to seriously underestimate the Soviet Union's strength. This is how Hitler evaluated the war. It would only take us a few hours to deal with Finland, yet the Soviet Union struggled so much against them. If our well-equipped, perfectly trained army were to attack the Soviet Union, what would be left of them? However, Hitler only saw the Red Army's poor performance on the battlefield. He overlooked the profound impact this war had on the Soviet Union. The Soviets fully absorbed the lessons from this war, reorganizing, retraining, and re-equipping their army. They ultimately completed a series of reforms. As Stalin said, our modernized Red Army got used to fighting on the Finnish front. That was its first baptism by fire. The Winter War also caught the special attention of Britain and France. It gave them an opportunity to intervene in the situation in Northern Europe. For a long time, the Nordic countries had followed a policy of neutrality. Among them, Sweden's iron ore supply was especially critical for Germany. After World War II broke out, Britain and France had been hoping to cut off this supply line to disrupt Germany's industrial production. If they sent troops directly into Sweden, they would inevitably be branded as aggressors. But now that the Soviet Union had invaded Finland, they could use supporting Finland as a pretext to demand that Norway and Sweden allow their troops to pass through. This put Hitler on high alert. He decided to invade Norway and Denmark. Once he occupied these two countries, Sweden would fall right into Germany's hands, with no possibility of being controlled by Britain and France. Seeing that Britain had laid mines in Norwegian waters, Hitler used Britain's violation of Norway's neutrality as an excuse and gave the order to attack. Operation Weserübung had begun. The German invasion of Denmark went very smoothly. When German bombers flew over Copenhagen, the King of Denmark surrendered immediately, setting a record for surrendering in 4 hours. But the invasion of Norway was a bit more of a struggle. Germany had spent a fortune building its newest cruiser, the Blücher, only to have it hit by Norway's antique last-century coastal defense guns. Then it was struck by two equally old Whitehead torpedoes. This top-tier German warship, only 6 months in the water, was sunk just like that. This fatal mistake delayed the German offensive, allowing the Norwegian royal family to successfully escape to Britain. The Norwegian army, meanwhile, continued to fight. With the help of allied British and French forces, it ultimately took the Germans 2 months to fully conquer Norway. This made Norway the country that held out against the Germans for the third longest time in World War II. After the success of Operation Weserübung, Hitler could finally turn his attention to his long-awaited attack on the Western Front. For so many years, Hitler had been haunted by dreams of World War I. He'd been defeated in that war, forced to watch helplessly as his country was humiliated and carved up. That shame had fueled him all the way to this moment. Now the time had finally come for a showdown with his old World War I nemesis, France. When invading Poland, Hitler hadn't interfered with the military planning, but once the enemy was France, he got involved directly. The plan from the Army High Command worried him. They intended to attack France by going through Belgium. This route was on flat terrain and avoided the Maginot Line. It seemed absolutely perfect. But the problem was it was too conventional. The British and French could easily guess the Germans would attack from there. They would definitely have a massive number of troops stationed along that line. Even if the German army defeated them, their losses would be catastrophic. Hitler hated the plan, calling it a military student's idea. He wanted a bolder, more surprising plan, and one man in particular caught his attention: Erich von Manstein. This chief of staff for Army Group A had been exploring another possibility. That was to punch through the Ardennes and attack Sedan, then make a straight dash for the English Channel. It would be like a scythe cutting down the Allied forces from behind. This plan was incredibly audacious. Because the Ardennes was a region of dense forests and rugged terrain, riddled with marshes, it was the worst possible territory for armored divisions to cross. The French would never in their wildest dreams have imagined the main German attack would come from there. As a result, it wasn't heavily defended. In fact, it wasn't just the French. Many of Germany's own high-ranking generals also thought it was impossible. Manstein hit a wall at every turn and was even transferred because of it. It wasn't until the original plan was accidentally leaked that his idea was finally given serious consideration. On February 17, 1940, Manstein finally had his meeting with Hitler. During this historic meeting, Hitler praised the plan enthusiastically and gave it his full support. A few days later, the German army began deploying its forces according to Manstein's plan. With his own country's plan sorted out, Hitler also tried to secure foreign assistance. On March 18th, his train pulled into the Brenner Pass 4,000 feet above sea level. The platform was covered in heavy snow. Mussolini was there waiting for him. This was their first meeting since the Munich Agreement. Hitler once again put his powers of persuasion on full display. When speaking of Germany's allies, he said that Germany's cooperation with the Soviet Union was just for show. Germany was only considering one true partner, and that was Italy. With battle imminent, Germany hoped to share its victory with a great nation. But if Italy was content with being a second-rate Mediterranean power, then it didn't have to do a thing, because Britain and France would always prevent him from becoming a first-rate power. Mussolini was both shocked and thrilled by these words. He expressed a strong desire to enter the war. Hitler was very satisfied with this. "Mussolini will go all the way with us," he said on the way back. Now everything was ready. Hitler didn't want to stay in Berlin to greet the arrival of this moment. He took his armored train to the Eifel Plateau. From here, the rumble of artillery on the front lines could be heard. Pointing to the west, Hitler announced, "Gentlemen, the offensive against the Western nations has begun." The speed of the German army shocked the world. In the north, the Netherlands surrendered in 5 days. Belgium was also in grave danger. The British and French Allied forces hurriedly dispatched their main forces as reinforcements. But what they didn't know was that they were actually facing the decoy, Army Group B. Meanwhile, the real main German force, Army Group A, was in the south, advancing through the dense forests of the Ardennes. When the German tanks suddenly burst out of the forest, the French army was stunned by the sight, as if soldiers had just descended from the heavens. They hadn't organized any kind of proper defense at all. Sedan was quickly captured. The German army immediately forced a crossing of the Meuse River. The British and French command rushed to dispatch fighter planes as reinforcements. On the afternoon of May 14th, above the Meuse, the most intense air battle since the war began erupted. In total, both sides committed more than 1,000 aircraft. Facing the Germans' dense ground-to-air network of fire, the British and French planes that came to help were like moths to a flame, only to be devoured again and again. The defensive line at the Meuse had fallen. There was nothing left to stop the German panzer divisions. They were making a mad dash, all the way to the English Channel. On the morning of May 15th, the French Prime Minister Reich gave Churchill a phone call. He was dejected. As he notified Churchill, we've already lost this war." Churchill was stunned into silence. The question was no longer how to save France, but how to get the British army back. At Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of British and French allied forces were about to be trapped by Army Group B to their front, and encircled and annihilated by Army Group A from behind. At this critical moment, Hitler suddenly issued a secret order to halt the advance. In his mind, the Allied forces at Dunkirk were already fish in a barrel. Göring had assured him that the Air Force alone could wipe them out, and Hitler was eager to push south and conquer France completely, not wanting his panzer divisions to waste any more time at Dunkirk. But 2 days later, he realized it was a disastrous mistake. The German Air Force was completely incapable of destroying the Allied forces at Dunkirk. By the time he ordered the advance toward Dunkirk again, it was all too late. The 48-hour delay had allowed more than 300,000 Allied soldiers to successfully evacuate. For Britain, where morale was at rock bottom, the Dunkirk evacuation was seen as an inspiring victory. It helped Churchill withstand the immense pressure from the faction pushing for surrender. For now, Britain could still defend itself, but France was powerless to resist. On June 18th, France surrendered, and soon after, Hitler set foot on the land he had just conquered. He held a military parade at the Arc de Triomphe, posed for a photo under the Eiffel Tower, and visited Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides. But the real main event was the signing ceremony on June 21st. Hitler ordered a train carriage to be brought out of a museum. It was in this very carriage that German representatives had surrendered to France 22 years earlier. The moment was photographed and published in newspapers all across the world. The Germans had always considered it a profound humiliation, and now Hitler was determined to avenge that shame. He was also going to accept France's surrender in that very same railroad car. On the day of the signing, as Hitler actually sat in that car, he became uncharacteristically silent. He received the French delegation without saying a single word. He later recalled that at that moment his heart was gripped by an intense feeling of revenge. After the ceremony, Hitler walked out of the car looking as if a great weight had been lifted. He told Goebbels over the phone, "I feel as if I've been reborn." Hitler took a train back to Berlin. From the station to the Imperial Chancellery, the streets were strewn with flowers. On both sides, tens of thousands of people were cheering themselves hoarse. For Hitler, he had become a hero in their eyes. He had avenged Germany's honor. In one fell swoop, he had erased 20 years of humiliation. After his triumphant return from France, Hitler wanted to stop. He planned to make peace with Britain. He believed that Britain was a vital element of global military power. If Britain were destroyed, its interests would be inherited by other great powers, not Germany. Besides that, there was another reason. As the Italian Foreign Minister Ciano said, Hitler is a gambler who has already made his fortune. He no longer wants to take risks and just wants to cash out and leave. But the game between great powers was still like a hand of cards. Every time you've won enough and want to leave, there's always a sore loser who drags you back to the table. For Hitler, that person was Churchill. When Hitler, from his position as a conqueror, sent his so-called appeal to reason to Britain, Churchill only took a few hours to reject the peace offer. Hitler was stunned and disappointed. He was slowly beginning to realize what kind of opponent he was up against. During the Dunkirk operation, in order to cover the retreat of the main forces, Churchill ordered the 3,000 British troops stationed in Calais not to retreat. They were to hold their ground. In the end, these defenders of Calais were almost all sacrificed. On July 3rd, considering that the French government had already surrendered, and the French fleet was likely to be used to attack Britain, Churchill made a decisive order to attack the French warships docked at the Mers el Kabir naval base. 1,250 French sailors died at the hands of their former allies. What these events painted was a picture of a man who, for the sake of the empire's interests, would sacrifice anything. He may not have had much humanity, But when war came, he was the empire's most dependable protector. Hitler would soon learn this during the Battle of Britain. No matter how many times his bombers blitzed London, Churchill simply would not surrender. Standing on the ruins, his speeches continually inspired the British people. What disappointed Hitler even more was Göring. The head of the Luftwaffe guaranteed that not a single British bomber would reach the Ruhr. If one did, he would change his last name to Meyer. Very soon, Hermann Göring became Hermann Meyer. The Royal Air Force not only bombed the Ruhr, but they even bombed Berlin. Hitler knew he had failed. The air war was lost. German tanks couldn't exactly float across the English Channel. Without air superiority, forcing a landing was nothing more than a fantasy. Hitler gave up on Britain, and instead turned his sights on a country he believed would be easier to defeat. History often regards the invasion of the Soviet Union as Hitler's most fatal mistake, but at the time the decision actually seemed quite reasonable. Our entire perception today of the Soviet Union as a powerful nation was only established after the Soviet-German War. Before that war, the Soviet Union's military record wasn't very impressive. When the USSR was first established, it was beaten by Germany and forced to cede territory for peace. Then it lost to Poland in the Polish-Soviet War. And in the Winter War, it paid a huge price, just to barely defeat Finland. So it wasn't just Hitler. Many high-ranking German officials believed that defeating the Soviet Union wouldn't be a difficult task. And the prospects of a war with the Soviets were very tempting. As Hitler said, the war against the Soviet Union would decide the fate of Europe. If the USSR was crushed, Britain would also give up the fight. Once Germany controlled the vast territories of the Soviet Union and its endless resources, it could never be defeated by anyone. With this in mind, Hitler sat back down at the poker table ready to play one last hand. On October 12, 1940, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov arrived in Berlin. He was trying to negotiate the division of spheres of influence with Hitler, but neither side was willing to compromise. The differences between Germany and the Soviet Union had become irreconcilable. As Molotov was about to leave, Hitler suddenly said to him, "I believe history will remember Stalin forever." Molotov thought he was just being polite and replied, "I have no doubt about that." Then Hitler added, "But I also hope that history will remember me." Molotov did not sense the deep murderous intent behind that sentence. What he didn't know was that before this meeting, Hitler had already given an order. Regardless of the meeting's outcome, preparations for the campaign on the Eastern Front were to continue. The die was already cast. 6 months later, the war between Germany and the Soviet Union broke out. Hitler had famously boasted that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that, with a single kick from him, would collapse entirely. And at the start of the war, it seemed like he was right. The front lines advanced at lightning speed and captured equipment piled up. The Soviet Red Army was being wiped out by the hundreds of thousands. For Hitler, the feeling of victory was so real that he overlooked the dangers lurking in the shadows. First, there was the sheer size of the Soviet Union. It was just too big. Even Germany's most elite, armored divisions couldn't swallow it whole. At its peak, the German army occupied 1.5 million square kilometers of Soviet territory. That's equivalent to 3 times the size of France. But how much did that really matter? The Soviet Union still had over 20 million square kilometers left. If Germany couldn't secure a quick victory, it would be forced into a war of attrition with the Soviets. It would come down to resources and manpower, and in that department, Germany had no advantage. Take manpower, for instance. Manpower is a very unique resource in war. In the short term, it doesn't just increase with the territory you conquer. Sure, Germany had occupied many countries like France. But would Hitler dare to conscript large numbers of Frenchmen? These were men who weren't even willing to die for their own country. So there was no way they were going to fight to the death against the Soviets for Germany. So the only people Hitler could truly rely on were the 80 million ethnic Germans. And the Soviets, they had 200 million. On top of that, the Soviet Union's ability to mobilize was even stronger than Germany's. Facing the threat of total annihilation, the Soviet Union had declared a full mobilization as early as 1941. Even women were being sent to fight. But Germany didn't do so until 1940. It took them 3 years to finally begin a total mobilization, and this was under incredibly unfavorable macroeconomic conditions. Hitler also picked up a bad habit. He got obsessed with micromanaging. With a stroke of a pen, he'd often send troops on pointless journeys. He also frequently gave out all sorts of unrealistic orders, causing his troops to miss their window of opportunity more than once. All of these factors were felt on the front lines. The German offensive got slower and slower, and after running out of oil and manpower, they irreversibly slid into the abyss of defeat. The Battle of Stalingrad was the prelude to the fall of the Nazi Empire. In this battle, the initiative on the Eastern Front completely changed hands. The German Field Marshal Paulus was captured. As his empire was about to crumble, Hitler had one last idea. He wanted to trade Stalin's son Yakov for Paulus. Stalin flatly refused. I will not trade a general for a soldier. Yakov eventually died in a German concentration camp. Grief and anger filled Stalin's heart. And there were millions of other Soviets just like him. In this war, almost every single Soviet had lost a loved one. This bone-deep hatred pushed them step by step all the way to Berlin. On Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery shells landed right above the bunker where he was hiding. It was all over. The defeat on the battlefield triggered the collapse of the Nazi regime. Defections and surrenders were happening one after another. Hitler felt a profound sense of helplessness and isolation. Everyone is lying to me. Everyone is betraying me. When Hitler had been abandoned by the entire world, there was only one person who brought him any comfort: his girlfriend Eva Braun. This woman braved the fires of war, traveling all the way from Munich to Berlin. She wanted to die there with Hitler, looking at his lover. Hitler suddenly awoke from the decades-long grand dream he'd had about the nation, its people, and the war. He had once promised to never marry for the sake of his country, but his country was no more. Before his death, Hitler and Eva held a wedding ceremony. They were husband and wife for only one day. This man who had spent his life trying to rule, dominate, and control people had only one thing left to do, and that was to choose his own ending. On April 30th, 1945, in a Berlin bunker beneath the ruins, Hitler pointed a pistol at his own head. So what exactly did Hitler do wrong? Strategically speaking, Hitler led with a reckless impatience for success. He always wanted to accomplish everything within his own lifetime. This really stemmed from his inner craving for fame and a prominent place in history. He was well-read in history and loved comparing himself to Bismarck and Frederick the Great. He was determined to have the most prominent place among all of Germany's great historical figures. His ambition pushed him to take huge risks time and time again, until it all came crashing down. In terms of self-perception, Hitler thoroughly enjoyed the personality cult that surrounded him. This adoration grew with his continued success, eventually reaching an unimaginable level. Hitler himself came to believe in this cult of personality. He no longer doubted himself and always believed he was right. This paved the way for all of his later dictatorial actions. All of the above were tactical mistakes. Hitler's true and most serious mistake was the Nazi ideology he believed in, and the resulting atrocities against humanity. Patriotism is a good thing. In most cases, nationalism is a good thing too. The problem with Hitler was that he was just too extreme. He saw the relationship between nations as a kind of zero-sum game of life and death. He drew a circle around all the chosen people and then said, the people outside this circle are the enemy. They are the source of all the suffering in the world. If we kill them all, we'll be happy. He killed many people, causing immense suffering in the world. But in the end, he couldn't give Germany a bright future. After World War II, Germany suffered a humiliation no less severe than after World War I. After World War II, Germany's territory compared to after World War I was reduced by 32%, leaving only 350,000 square kilometers. And even that little bit of land was torn in two by the East and West, serving as the very front line of the Cold War, thanks to Hitler. For a very long time, the German people lived under the original sin of the Nazi Holocaust and racism. Its status as a defeated nation also limited Germany's development. In stark contrast to the Nazi Empire, today's Germany hasn't killed a single Jew. Instead, it's the world's fourth largest economy and a pillar of the EU. Post-war, generation after generation of German people and politicians have proven that you don't need aggression or mass murder to live a good life.